From First Paw Media, sponsored by Dream Chaser Leadership in Anchorage, Alaska. This is the Peak Experience Podcast. Here we talk about leadership, team building, strategic management, and organizational development. Visit our website, peakexp.org. Now, here are your hosts, Robert and Michelle Forto.
Hello and welcome, everybody. This is Robert for the Peak Experience Podcast, and I am joined by my co-host, Dr. Latoya Skinner. She is calling in from North Carolina, and today we're talking about data analysis in a doctorate or dissertation project. If you have not listened to the previous episodes, I urge you to go back and listen to those. We've talked about topics such as lit review, sampling, research questions, purpose statements, framework, all of that. I think this is our 7th or 8th episode, and we have just a couple of more in this series. So now we have all of our data and we're ready to go. But before we jump into that, Latoya, how's it going in your neck of the woods?
It is cold and rainy today, but it is a wonderful day. I hope all is well with you.
All is well. We are in the throes of winter here at the time of recording. I'm looking forward to spring. I'm sure that you are as well. Looking forward to graduation and all of that. It's going to be a busy time, isn't it?
Absolutely. So exciting to look forward to those things. I have them on my calendar and I've been counting down the days.
For sure. So let's jump right into this. Guys that are listening, we're going to ask each other 6 questions. And the way that we typically do this is I will ask Latoya, she will give me her answer, then I will give mine. We may have a couple of follow-up questions based on this, but this is, like we said, the nitty-gritty of a study. We've done all of the background work. Most of our project is done to this point, and now we have all of this data that we have to do something with, and that's the purpose of a research study. So Latoya, please quickly remind our listeners, what was the topic of your project?
Yes, my topic was ineffective communication, understanding the interruption of poor communication between leaders and employees in nonprofit organizations.
And I studied transgenerational succession in a family firm with an emerging female leader. So a little bit about the same type of thing in terms of dealing with an organization that has some type of problem that we're trying to fix. In a professional doctorate like Latoya and I went through, we worked with one particular organization. They provided us a problem, and we tried our best to give them some guidance or an answer to that problem. And that's where this data analysis comes in. We've got all this data. We've done our interviews. Now we have to figure out what we're going to do with it. So Latoya, I'm going to ask you the first question here. It is, what are the key considerations when selecting the right data analysis method for your project?
Yes, I think that assessing what you want from the raw data for it to be utilized specifically for decision making and the statistics of your project, because ultimately you're going to be the decision maker as the researcher. And so you want to make sure that whatever method you use is going to be appropriate, number one, and it's going to be helpful to help you draw those conclusions.
So before I jump into this, I have to ask, because I know people say things differently. Do you say data or data?
You know, I say data or data. I actually don't have a preference. And I don't know if that's because of my Virginia native tongue or what it is, but I'm more prone to say data.
And I say data. Interesting how we talk from different parts of the world. And I don't know if you know this, Latoya, but I spent about 4 or 5 years in North Carolina, and I went to high school in Virginia. So I am from your neck of the woods. So
yes.
I don't know where those accents cross or change, but here we are with data and data. For folks that are listening, let us know how you pronounce it, and we'll go from there. So you talked about you are the one that hold the keys to your research project, and that's a key component, especially in a professional doctorate. You are literally the only one that is doing this project. You don't have a group of researchers, you don't have a team, you don't have a lab, you don't have anything like that. So when you're working through a problem like this, that is a key consideration is you have to understand when you go into this that you are the one that is going into it with your question and with your the issues that you're trying to solve. And the best way to do
Mm-hmm.
that is figuring out a way where it's an unbiased response. And I think that that is key in terms of considerations. So the key to this is when you are starting a project like this is, I guess, my considerations, Latoya, is don't go in expecting to have the answers to the questions. And I think a lot of people, just in general, life and communication with each other, we already kind of know what we want people to say or do, but
Right.
that's not necessarily the case in a research project. You want to guide them down the way, but you do not want to guide them in a way that will give them the answer that you're looking for. Is that correct in your instance?
Absolutely. I think that's a wonderful explanation. And you just want to make sure that you're figuring out the problem. You don't already have the answer to the problem when you start. And so regardless of what your experience has been, you don't have the answer yet.
Right. Question number two is how can researchers ensure the validity and reliability of their data analysis in a doctoral study? And I just want to preface that very quickly. We talked a little bit about that in our last episode where we talked about sampling and interview guides and questionnaires and surveys and focus groups and all of that. So now we've taken this a step further. We've hopefully have our questions lined out and we're sitting down with our participants. So how are we ensuring that reliability, at least in your study?
Yeah, so with my study, I did everything the same way because I didn't want to skew anything. I didn't want to create any biases. And I just wanted everything that one participant experienced to be the same experience for another participant. And so I think that was very helpful to me and just making sure that um, everything was streamlined across the board with my research project. And that included the platform that I used, the analysis tool that I used, which was Qualtrics. I think that helps with the accuracy of the findings and just making sure that what you're capturing is actually reliable and just remaining consistent.
Right. And in my case, I went into this into a very small family business, a service business here in Alaska, and I was taken aback by how close these people were when I started sitting down with them to interview them. And it was truly a family type business where everybody knew each other. They had barbecues together, they went on trips together, the whole thing. I mean, it was a family affair. And that posed a couple of problems. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But like you, Latoya, I did my best to make sure everything was exactly the same to every single person. So when I was interviewing the leader of the group, who in my case was the mother of the family firm, I
Mm-hmm.
asked exact same questions that I asked the daughters, who were going to be the successors, that I asked the sales department, that I asked the office staff, all the way down to the employees that did not have a leadership position. So I wanted to make sure that everything was valid, at least in that instance, where if all the questions are the same, hopefully they will provide data. Remember, the answer is the data. So you want to
Right.
make sure those answers are given in a way that are usable. And a key component to this, and we may talk about this in a second, but even a I don't know or I don't have an answer for a question is data. Isn't that right?
I 100% agree. I think everything that I was provided in my research was helpful in some way.
So the next question, as we're moving right along here, is what common pitfalls do doctoral candidates face when interpreting the data, and how can we avoid them?
That is a good question. I think, for someone like me who my topic relates heavily to nonprofits and communication and just my experience overall, I think it is easy to be caught up in the biases and not realize that you are skewing your data that way. And I think that, again, it goes back to the word consistency for me, and just making sure that everything that you are receiving is reliable to your research project, because after all, you're supposed to be collecting this information. You're supposed to be able to break it down and interpret it and be able to discuss your information, your data in your report. And so I think the challenges come from possibly being biased ahead of time and feeling like you already have the answer, because again, you don't have the answer. And so you're working toward that end goal, and hopefully that you will discover what your answer is and answer your question, your research questions, and be able to use that information to bring about basically the big picture of your research project. And so I think those are some challenges. Those are some challenges that I face, because I have to constantly tell myself that you're not a participant. You are the holder of the work. You are the person that's owning this project. And so you have to keep your thoughts and opinions to yourself. So I think that for me was a personal challenge.
And that is an excellent point. You are not a participant. And I tried to keep that in my mind when I went into this, because, like you, we were very familiar with the inner workings of the types of organizations that we worked with. You were working with a nonprofit, I was working with a family business, and it took a lot of effort not to provide insight or answers or agreement or disagreement or any type of nod, if you will, to the questions that people were answering. And when I was doing it, I did it all on like a Zoom type platform. I was using a platform called Riverside. So even the simple body language back and forth on a video conferencing platform can easily influence data, especially if they're saying things that they are not quite sure they should be saying. And if you're nodding, or if you're saying it's okay to answer that or whatever, that can have a profound effect on the data that you collect. So you have to go into this almost like a closed-minded type interviewer. You have to go there, kind of head down, one foot in front of the other, and just sort of just working your way through this, because that does have an effect, and that can be a pitfall that a lot of new researchers can get involved with. Another thing that I was not really expecting is, in our particular project, when we went through our courses at Liberty, we were very guided in the way that we could do things. In particular, the interview guide. We had to have a certain format. We had to have certain types of questions. These questions had to be approved ahead of time. They had to go through a process to get that approval. So by the time we were sitting down, at least in my case, and we'll come back to Latoya on this in a second. So by the time we were sitting down with our participants, we had this list of questions that had been approved ahead of time. And when we sat down to ask them, it was difficult to be able to navigate in different realms, because that would go off of the guide. And I think that in my case, I had a little bit of a struggle, because my organization was such a tight knit organization, that not only were they, quote unquote, a little bit of afraid to answer some of the questions, even though it was anonymous, so that sort of stuff, but they didn't want to, quote unquote, tattletale on their boss. They didn't want to hurt somebody's feelings, all those sorts of things. So it was difficult to navigate that. That was definitely a pitfall. And secondly, when I was working with, in particular, the folks that were not in a leadership role, they just didn't have any experience with any of the questions I was asking. And since I was talking about succession in a family firm, I remember some of my participants didn't even know it was happening. They said, "What are you talking about? We didn't know this was happening." Now, of course, that's great data, but
Right.
they were unaware that a process was even taking part. So back to you, Latoya, in terms of your guide, when you had it set, you had it approved by your research chair and the admin reviewer and all of that, you had your questions ready to go. Was that a pitfall for you, meaning that this was it was a guide in the definition sense, but it was also the questions that we were, I guess, allowed to ask, right?
Yes, and much like your experience, I use the interview guide for my participants and ask them the questions that were appropriate for their groups. But there was a lot of reluctance from the participants, and so I had to reassure them that this was a safe space for them to be able to communicate because, after all, when my research was over, they still had to work there or be there and volunteer. And so one of the things that I did not want to do was make it uncomfortable for them to be genuine because, again, the goal was to get the data from them. And the data was based on whatever they told me.
And I want to stick with this for just a second. So, by having this guide, this is going to come up here in just a second when we talk about how we are going to work with this data. Is the reason for the guide is it provides a blueprint or a map for what we're going to do next. Did you ask any questions? Did you veer off in any way? Did you go off on a tangent, if you will, with any of your participants? Did any of that kind of go into the weeds a little bit, or did you just kind of just stick with what you had?
So I tried to stick as close to what I had, but there were a few instances where I kind of had to guide the conversation to quote unquote pull more out of the participant, um, just to get a better understanding of whatever their initial answer was, because again, there was reluctance, and so being able to break down what they were telling me was extremely important, and that required me to kind of think a little bit differently and shift in certain ways.
Yeah, I did the same thing. I was pretty head down, one foot in front of the other type in terms of my questions going through the process, with the exception of my last question. And it was one of those types of questions you would ask on any type of interview. I do it almost all the time on every podcast, is I will ask something like, is there anything else you would like to add? And of course, that is a very wide open ended question, and it allows the participant, the interviewee, whomever you're talking to pretty much say whatever's on their mind. And I did that for a couple of different reasons. Number one, to get data points that were not collected in terms of on my questions. So it allowed me to kind of get their own ideal, their own narrative of the process. And I think that helped out a lot. It was a struggle when we went down to code and theme and all of that, but I got a lot of rich data there that I used in my findings and my interpretations and my next part of the paper. Did you do anything like that? Did you sort of open up the can of worms, if you will, at all?
Oh yeah, I had a lot of open-ended questions for them to kind of spill the beans. And again, once I provided that disclaimer about the safe space, it really drove those conversations. And like I said before in a previous segment, I was able to find themes very early on in my research process because the conversations really flowed and there were so many similarities.
So let's talk about the different types of data. We have qualitative and quantitative. Those are the two big pieces of the pie, if you will. Of course, we have mixed methods and all of that sort of stuff. But can you describe in your own ideal what those two are, Latoya, qualitative and quantitative?
Yeah, so qualitative, think quality. And it's non-numeric. There are, no numbers, and it's just more about the quality of the research. And when it comes to quantitative is the complete opposite. It's about the numbers and things like that. And so I think that for me, I use qualitative because I needed my work to be done in a different way. And so I was able to use qualitative analysis to develop an understanding of the phenomena and develop findings and outcomes related to my communication topic. And so that included, coding, verifying, and exploring the data as a part of that analysis. And again, each topic has a different need for each analysis. So it depends on what's most appropriate for your research.
And like you, I describe quantitative as numbers, and describe qualitative as stories or ideas. And I think that's the best way to look at it, especially for new researchers, is when you're doing quantitative type data collection, you have this group of people, and you're trying to form a an interpretation based on that number. So a good example would be a poll. A very simple poll would be a good way to do quantitative analysis. So it'd be, do you like summer or winter? And if 55% of the people say summer and 45% say winter, that is a quantitative analysis on that very basic question. Then, of course, you could ask a bunch of follow-up questions to that, and even use a mixed methods approach with that. If you could say, do you enjoy summer or winter? And that would be quantitative. And then you could say in the next question on your poll, describe why you like summer or winter, and then that would be qualitative. Is that correct, Latoya?
Yes, absolutely agree. And the way that you put that is so very well put. And when it comes to these two analyses and the difference between the two, it really is also the determining factor of, as you gave the example, how you ask your question.
Yes. And am I remembering correctly? Did we have to use qualitative? If I remember correctly, it had to be a qualitative or mixed method study. We could not just do solely quantitative. Is that right?
That is correct.
Yep. And do you know why that is? Is it because of the nature of the project, where we're trying to get an answer from an organization, or was there another reason? I don't know the answer to that.
I don't know either, but that would make sense. I wouldn't be surprised, just given the subject matters and the type of degree that we are working on. So that would not surprise me.
So let's talk about interpreting the data here in this next question. So the question is sort of a catch-all. Can you describe your interpretive process? We're going to talk about tools in a second, but what was that method? So now you've conducted your interviews, you have all of this rich information, you have these interviews done, you have your surveys, your focus groups, whatever we use to collect this data. So now we're going to figure out what we're going to do with it. Describe that process in the most succinct way you can, Latoya.
Yeah, so first of all, data interpretation is going through and analyzing and just kind of learning how to make sense of what you are what you have from the data. And so for me, I did find that kind of challenging because, again, this was my first time ever conducting research. And so for me, using my analytical tool from Google, that was really helpful to me. Again, like I said, I developed themes kind of early on, and just being able to kind of break those conversations down, because I'd never been in a space where I was breaking down conversations for the purpose of data. And so that was a challenge for me. So this part of the research was a little bit of a challenge. And for me, just being able to organize my conversations and the pieces from the conversations, and just making sense and making them purposeful to the research is kind of what I did through the interpretation.
Yeah, I also found this a big challenge. I've done smaller research topics before, but nothing to this depth for sure. And when I set out to do this, when I had all of the information collected, we both Latoya and I used video conferencing software. I believe you used Teams. I used Riverside. So we had our interviews in place. Then we transcribe those interviews, and we had to figure out what we're going to do with all of these answers. And I used a pretty robust tool. We're going to talk about the tools in just a second to break those down into segments. And I found to be very difficult, Latoya, is we had all of these questions and answers. So the questions were easy to code because it was all the same. So we could code, and I use Innovo to do mine. So questions about leadership were coded red, and questions about succession were coded green, et cetera, et cetera. And then when we broke it down, that's where it became difficult because I had codes and nodes and all sorts of things all over the place because people were answering questions in different ways. And I know that that is important data, but most of these people, I'm sure in your case and as in mine, they were not looking at it as a research project. They were looking at it as a conversation. So when you asked questions and they answered whatever answer they provided, it was very difficult to break that down if you did not have a good methodology to do so. And I remember thinking, my goodness, all of these people have really answered the question in the same way, but they answered it in a different way to put it in its own theme, bracket, node, if you will, all on its own. Did you face any of that as well?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I feel like they walked in, of course, just thinking that they were having a conversation, which is ultimately what they signed up for. But for us, being on the opposite side of that, we were challenged with breaking that down and what does it mean. And I'm really impressed that you color coded and did everything like that, because even I wasn't even that organized in my research to think that far. But again, this was a challenging part of the research work for me, and so it really helped me to grow in this area. But it was definitely very hard for me. And one thing about your interpretation is that you want it to be accurate and you want it to be truthful.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about themes. And that's the whole idea behind this, because we're going to talk a lot about how these themes developed into interpretations and interpreted into findings in our next episode. So I remember back when we were doing the lit review, one of the sections was discovered and anticipated themes in the literature. Do you remember those themes, and did a lot of those themes carry over into the themes after your data was collected?
Oh, absolutely. They definitely did. And I think for me, again, one of the things that I had to just be careful about was forming any biases. And like, for example, one of my anticipated themes was lack of organizational management and change. And then another was the employee perception and the lack of satisfaction and opportunities. And the new themes that developed were like communication development and can't remember. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank, but they all ended up tying in together. They were a little bit different, but not very far off. And so it was thrilling to see through those conversations with the participants what they developed for me as themes and what I had already developed as a preconceived notion under the anticipated themes. And so to see them tie in together was actually quite thrilling for me.
And do you remember in your data analysis, once you got it through the software and broke it all down, do you remember how many themes you had to work with that ended up being the next section of this, of the interpretation and the findings? How many themes were held?
Yeah, I think mine was like three or four. It wasn't a lot, but they were definitely heavy hitters, the ones that did develop.
Right. And like you, when we were doing those early parts of the project, in particular the lit review, those anticipated and discovered themes in the literature did carry over. One of them was very prevalent, and that was lack of readiness, because in family business succession, lack of readiness is quoted as the number one reason why successions fail. So that was by far a theme, not only in the literature, but also a theme in the data. female leadership was also a theme because that was sort of my guiding topic, if you will, in terms of the literature. But it was also a theme in the data. One emerging theme or discovered theme that I did not find necessarily in the early parts of the research was innovation. And I found that that was very interesting because in today's day and age, people are figuring out ways to become innovative in their businesses, and whether they're using trainings or conferences or whatever. That was an emerging theme that really played into my findings. And then lastly, the theme that was the most problematic, if you will, was the information that was passed along in terms of that theme. And I found to be very difficult. That's the next question is, like I said earlier in this episode, people just didn't know it was happening and they did not have information to provide. And that became a pretty prevalent theme in my data. So many people just didn't know an answer. And yes, that is data, as we said, but it proved to be a real sticking point in terms of the findings because, in my case, this family business succession, they just weren't ready, or they didn't even know what was going to be happening later on in order to provide a good result for the outcome. So the next one, Latoya, we have a couple of questions here to go, and that is, how did you handle unexpected results in your data analysis during your project?
I don't know that I had a lot of unexpected results. I think because early on, you know, these participants discussed with me their concerns, which led to an overall theme about lack of clarity within the organization based on communication or the lack thereof. I didn't run into too many concerns when it came to that. So I don't know if that was a blessing or not, but that wasn't something that I had to really attend to. I think that, their conversations led to the data that they provided and being able to break it down. And just again, when I developed those anticipated themes, it helped me to think through or explore what that meant in terms of, my subject matter. And so I wasn't really challenged with that.
I had a couple of very interesting examples of this. As I've said in previous episodes, when I contacted the organization, I was contacted by the daughter of the mother who is the owner of the business. And she came to me and said, "Hey, we're going through this process. We could really use some help in figuring out what we want to do next in terms of succession." And this person was fully in believing that she was going to be the successor. And I remember, Latoya, I interviewed her third in my process. So I interviewed her sister right before her. And I remember when we were talking to her, I said, one of the questions was, "Do you know who's going to be the successor for this company?" And she immediately said, "It is going to be me. I'm going to be the successor." And I did a follow-up question of, "Is there anyone else?" And she said, "No, there is not going to be anybody else." So, of course, I did not say anything because I knew that her sister thought that she was going to be the successor of the company. So that was a very interesting result right off the top. And I had to figure out a way how we could capture that data in these two very distinct, almost black versus white answers. I'm going to be the successor, and the other person says, "No, I'm going to be the successor." So I had to figure out how we were going to use that in our data analysis. Another interesting result is I had several, and remember I said that these were very closely held employees, family type. It was, it's like going to a family barbecue with these folks. And I had several people, not necessarily in upper management or upper leadership, but as you sort of trickled down in terms of leadership capabilities in the firm. I had several people that out and out refused to answer questions. And I think that they thought, even though it was a very protected space, very safe space, they didn't want to quote unquote get in trouble by saying an answer. And I remember especially these I don't want to say lower members of the firm, but that's
Mhm.
the example I can give. They were very hesitant, and some of them just said, "I refuse to answer that." And it reminded me of like one of those courtroom dramas on television where they say, "I refuse to answer this," or "I plead the fifth," or whatever they say. Did you have any of that where people just out and out refused to answer your questions?
I did not. I think because of the subject matter and just the nature of the conversation, a lot of them were just happy to get it off their chest. Um, and there were a lot of uh, frustrations, I will say, with respect to them. And the organization I felt like was a good organization, but they definitely had some challenges. And so my conversations, no one told me no, but they, a couple of conversations were definitely uncomfortable to be a part of. And I did have one, just thinking about your previous question. I did have one participant that kind of rambled, and it became more of a gripe session, and so I had to veer her back to our purpose.
Yep.
And so that was a bit challenging.
And that goes right into our next question in terms of tools. And both of us, we've talked about the beginning tools that we used with Zoom and a transcriber, and I used the Innovo and that to kind of guide me down the line. But tell us a bit about your tools. I know we've mentioned these before, and how did you deal with that person in particular that sort of rambled? How did you deal with that in terms of interpreting the data? So if they just sort of went on this tangent, how did you deal with that?
Yeah, so in terms of the tools, I use Microsoft Teams and the transcriber and the recorder, which was really helpful. And I think just personal tools was just being friendly and warm and inviting, and also reassuring. Because again, I think if someone
Okay.
came to me in my workplace and asked me questions about the truth, I would be hesitant to speak to. And so just creating a space of safety for them to kind of provide truthful information that didn't come with any reservations, I think was very helpful. And regarding that one participant, when it came to her, what I did was I say uncomfortable, and even now being able to communicate this is uncomfortable because it was very awkward. um but it was almost as if she felt like she was having a conversation with a close friend. And so she was dealing with her pet and a couple of other things, and I had to finally just ask her, do you think now is a good time, or should we reschedule? And I think when I asked that, that brought her back to, this has a purpose to it, this is a professional environment. um and this is not, a gossip session. This is a very intentional process. A lot of work has been put into this professionally. And so I think for my conversation with her, once she realized that we weren't going to gossip, that this was not what I was here for, it brought her back to the beginning. And so I started redirecting my questions to redirect her focus.
That's a great point to do that. In my case, as I mentioned, using a uh, video conferencing software, you use Teams. I used Riverside, very similar to Zoom. I used Otter AI for a transcriber. That's what I use for my podcast, so I was very familiar with that. And the good thing about that is it separates speakers. So it was very easy once I used the coding software that all of my questions were easy to take apart compared to the answer from the participant. So that was a little bit easier. And then I used that in Nevo or in Novo software. It's kind of I don't want to say the gold standard, but what a lot of people use for this type of research. So once I had all of the transcripts done, I just imported the files over into that software, imported the transcriptions, if you will, and then it provided ways to code those down, whether it be participant or theme or question or node or anything like that. It was able to break those down to be able to figure it out. And the cool thing about that particular software, and I'll come back to you with your particular tool, it allowed me to instantaneously do charts and graphs and plot points and all of those things to see where the data was coming together. I thought that was a very key feature to what I used. And very quickly on the Innovo software is I highly recommend that you sign up for a student or researcher account. There's no reason to buy the very expensive version with the transcriber. There are several other tools out there that can do an excellent job to be able to do that. So let's come back to you very quickly, Latoya, on your coding software, on your analysis software. Did it provide tools that would do charts or graphs, or did you have to go outside of that and use something like Excel or something to do those charts and graphs and such?
Yeah, I created my own I think I did it in Excel, or I think I did it in Sheets, Google Sheets, actually. So I created my own.
You did. And what I found is once those were done, it was just so easy to be able to use those in our project. And in my case, I'm sure with yours, they kept asking for charts and graphs and sort of stuff to enter into the project. I remember when it came back, I asked my chair, how many charts or graphs do you think that we should have? And she said, oh, I suggest that you have one chart or graph for every theme that you had. So I knew right away I had 6 themes in my data analysis section. So I knew very quickly I had to have pretty robust charts to do that. And remember, you should not include this type of chart or graph or something for the sake of entering it. It should be able to tell a story with the data. And I think that you would agree with me there, right, Latoya?
Oh yeah, I definitely agree. And that's one of the reasons why I chose to do my own, because I wanted to definitely create a relationship between the two.
Right. So guys, that is it on our data analysis section. I'm going to come back to Latoya in just a second see if she has anything to add. But on our next podcast, it's going to be really fun, I think. That's where we're going to talk about what those findings provided. And I think that that's key, because this is exactly what we're working for. This is what we sat through this entire program for, to figure out what the data said and what we're going to do with it. And I think that's going to be a really fun episode. Latoya, before we go, is there anything else you want to add? And lastly, how can folks contact you?
Yes, as always, the only thing I want to add is encouragement for current students and even future students, that when you get to this part, it is a challenge, but you are one step closer to the finish line. So continue on and know that you are supported. And I can be reached on all socials at my name, or my email address is lskinner, the number 5, at liberty.edu.
Very good. And I don't have anything to add right at this point. I typically do a pretty good show note section, and I'm going to include some of these tools that we used and all of that. And I can be reached on all of the socials and on the web under my name, Robert Forto. That is Forto. On behalf of my co-host and guest on this series, Dr. Latoya Skinner, thank you for your time, and we'll talk again soon, okay?
It's been a pleasure. Have a good one.
Thank you. On behalf of my guest, this is Robert. We will see you guys next time. Goodbye.
From First Paw Media, this is the Peak Experience Podcast. We hope you enjoyed this podcast, and we invite you to subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You will find a link in our episode notes. You can tap or swipe on the episode cover art, and you'll see some offers from our sponsors. You can support our show by supporting them. If you like what you have heard, we would love it if you would give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends how to subscribe too.